The whistle shrieked, cutting through the cold morning air like a blade, and I watched George step onto the carriage with a smile that should have warmed me, but didn't. It was too calm, too deliberate, as though it had been placed carefully on his face for my benefit. The platform was a haze of steam and soot, muffling the shuffle of boots and the hiss of the waiting engine. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the first shiver of unease. He had kissed me goodbye, murmured something about business in the city, and turned away without looking back. But in that final second before the doors closed, he glanced at me with a strange light in his eyes, almost relief. I stood rooted to the planks as the heavy black doors clanged shut. My gloved hands tightened around the handle of my bag, not knowing why. George's carriage window reflected the gold morning light, blurring his features, but I saw his lips move. A single word, too far for me to hear, formed silently against the glass. I wanted to wave, but the weight in my stomach kept my arms still. The train jerked, wheels screeching against the rails, and began to roll forward. Steam swallowed his figure, leaving me staring at an empty pane of glass. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet metal, and every sound, the clank of couplings, the muttered goodbyes of strangers, felt strangely distant. That was when I noticed it. The faint outline of an envelope peeking from inside my handbag. I didn't remember putting it there. My fingers, stiff from the cold, pulled it out. It was thick, heavier than it should have been. For a moment I thought it might be one of George's ledgers, the kind he guarded so jealously in his study. But no, this was sealed in plain paper, unmarked. The weight shifted inside, not flat like papers, but dense, uneven. I looked up instinctively, scanning the platform. Everyone seemed intent on their own farewells, but in the far corner, a man in a grey coat stood perfectly still, watching me. A sudden gust swept down the tracks, curling through my coat and biting into my skin. I wanted to open the envelope then and there, but something in me resisted, as if crossing that line right here in the open would set something irreversible into motion. My heart began to beat faster, not from the cold. The train rounded the curve and disappeared into the fog. George was gone. All that was left was the echo of that strange smile and the heavy envelope in my hand. I slipped it back into my bag, its weight now impossible to ignore, and started walking toward the exit. The man in the grey coat stepped away from the wall, his eyes fixed on me, and began to follow. I didn't look back until the sound of his footsteps drew closer. The grey-coated man was moving with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who didn't want to alarm me, but wanted me to know he was there. I stepped aside to let a porter pass, using the moment to slip between a group of travellers heading for the station doors. The crowd carried me forward into the dim concourse, but the weight in my bag felt like a burning coal against my hip. By the time I reached the empty end of a wooden bench, my breath was shallow. I sat, placed the bag in my lap, and unfastened the clasp with trembling hands. The envelope came free, its seal unbroken, the paper slightly crumpled from my grip. I hesitated only a second longer before tearing it open. The first thing that spilled out was money, thick stacks of foreign banknotes worn at the edges but crisp in the middle. They smelled faintly of damp paper and something metallic. My fingers froze on the second item. It was a photograph. A woman's face stared back at me, unsmiling, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat. She could not have been older than 25. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were almost my own. The same shape, the same shade, though sharper, colder somehow. I turned the photo over. No name, no date, just a faint smudge of ink, as though something had once been written and rubbed away. My mind reached for the easiest explanation, the one that hurt the most, an affair. The thought sat in my chest like ice. But then, why the money? Why hide it in my bag rather than take it with him? My fingers traced the edges of the photograph, trying to will the stranger into giving up her secret. Somewhere behind me, a train's brakes screeched, snapping me back to the present. A memory surfaced uninvited. George returning home late these past months, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and foreign cologne, claiming it was from clients. The half-finished letters in languages I didn't understand, the locked drawer in his study. Things I had told myself were not worth worrying over. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I glanced up to find the man in the grey coat, leaning casually against a pillar, not 20 feet away, his gaze fixed squarely on me. He tilted his head slightly as though signaling me to stay where I was. My pulse quickened. Whatever George had left me, it wasn't just money and a photograph. It was something that could make strangers watch me in train stations. The man in the grey coat began walking toward me, not hurried, but with a purpose that made the space between us feel smaller with every step. I gripped the photograph tightly, the edges biting into my palm, and tried to keep my face blank. My instinct told me to run, yet my body remained fixed to the bench as though moving would somehow signal fear, and fear, I sensed, was exactly what he wanted to see. When he stopped in front of me, the scent of tobacco drifted from his coat. His voice was low, almost conversational. "You don't know what you're carrying, Mrs. Ellison." My stomach knotted. He knew my name. "I don't know what you mean," I said, forcing the words to sound casual, though my throat was dry. His mouth curved in the faintest smile. "George shouldn't have left it with you. It's not safe." Something in his tone made me believe he wasn't speaking only of the envelope. I tightened my grip on my bag. "If you know my husband, you can tell him yourself when he returns," I replied. The man shook his head slowly. "He won't be returning. And if you value your life, you'll forget you ever saw what's inside." His eyes dropped briefly to the bag, then lifted again to mine, unreadable. My heart thudded hard enough that I was sure he could hear it. "Who are you?" I asked. He ignored the question, leaning slightly closer. "George is being hunted, not for debts, not for women, for something far worse." His breath was warm, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now they will come for you." A laugh bubbled in my throat, thin and brittle, because the alternative was to let terror root itself fully in me. "This is absurd," I said, standing quickly. But he matched my movement, slipping something small and cold into my gloved hand. I looked down. A key. Old brass, worn from use. "Don't trust him," the man murmured. Then, without another word, he turned and melted into the crowd, swallowed by the steam and noise of the station. I stood there holding the key, the photograph, and a growing certainty that George's strange smile had not been for love, but for goodbye. The cab ride home felt longer than the journey to the station. I sat rigid, the brass key pressing into my palm, the photograph and money locked in my bag. Outside, autumn rain began to fall in fine slanted threads, turning the cobblestones slick. I kept replaying the man's words in my mind, "George won't be returning," and tried to decide whether they were a threat, a warning, or both. The house was silent when I arrived, except for the faint ticking of the hall clock. George's coat still hung on the peg by the door, but there were small signs he'd left in a hurry. A drawer in the bureau left half open, a teacup unwashed on the kitchen table. I lit the lamp in his study and sat down at the desk, staring at the locked lower drawer I'd never dared touch before. My pulse quickened as I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly. Inside was a wooden box, the kind one might use for storing letters. Its surface was scratched, the clasp tarnished. The key fit here too. When the lid lifted, the smell of old paper and ink rose up. Inside, more stacks of foreign banknotes, a leather wallet containing 3 different passports, all with George's photograph, but under different names, and several letters written in a mix of German and Russian. The sight made my breath hitch. I pulled out one letter, the handwriting precise but unfamiliar. Some words I recognized, others I did not. Certain phrases, dates, locations, were underlined in red pencil. My hands trembled as I realized I had stumbled into something that felt like the edge of a war, though no declaration had been made. My husband's import business had been a shield for something else entirely. The rain tapped harder against the window, as though urging me to hurry. I folded the letter back into the box, mind racing. If the man in the grey coat had spoken the truth, whatever George was tangled in had now wrapped itself around me. Every instinct told me to burn it all and pretend I'd never seen it, but the photograph in my bag said otherwise. I locked the box and returned it to the drawer, though the knowledge of its contents sat heavily in my chest. George was not the man I thought I'd married, and now perhaps I was not the woman I thought I was either. I couldn't stare at that photograph any longer without knowing who she was. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the streets slick and shining. I wrapped the picture in a handkerchief, slid it into my coat pocket, and walked to the police station 2 streets over. Inside, the air was heavy with tobacco smoke, and the damp wool of uniforms hung out to dry. I asked for Edward Foster, a family friend who worked in records, and was shown to a cramped office piled high with files. He greeted me warmly enough, but his brow furrowed when I laid the photograph on his desk. "I just want to know if she's in your records," I said, trying to keep my voice even. He hesitated, then pulled the picture toward him, holding it under the desk lamp. The light caught in his spectacles as he stared for longer than seemed necessary. Finally, he slid the photograph back toward me. "Doris, "You didn't get this from George, did you?" My stomach lurched. "Why?" He sighed, glancing at the closed door before lowering his voice. "She's been reported missing for over a year. Last seen near the border. They think she was carrying something important. Some believe she was part of the resistance." The word resistance seemed to drain the color from the room. "And the police are looking for her?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not exactly. Too many sides involved. Some want her found alive, others—" He trailed off, the implication clear. "Be careful who you ask about her." I tucked the photo back into my pocket, my pulse quickening. If George had been involved with this woman, whether as ally or enemy, then the danger surrounding her was now surrounding me. The missing woman's eyes stared from my memory, cold and unblinking. Walking home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed again. Each time I turned, the street was empty, but the hairs at the nape of my neck remained standing. That night, I dreamed of trains plunging into darkness, of smoke curling into shapes that looked like her face. The ringing woke me at 2 a.m., slicing through the silence of the house like a blade. I stumbled from bed, the cold floor biting at my bare feet, and lifted the receiver. At first, I heard only static. Then, a low male voice, foreign, deliberate. "Agent Marlowe." I froze, the name unfamiliar yet charged with weight. "You've got the wrong number," I said, my voice unsteady. There was a pause, then the voice softened, almost pitying. "No, we've got the right one. And tell George, he's crossed the line. They'll be coming for you next." The click of the receiver slamming down was louder than it should have been, echoing in the dark. My hand trembled as I replaced the receiver. The house seemed to shrink around me, shadows lengthening in the corners. Then I saw it. Movement outside just beyond the front gate. Two silhouettes, barely visible, standing too still for too long. The rain had started again, glistening on their shoulders under the dim street lamp. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. If George was Agent Marlowe, if these people thought I was part of whatever he'd done, then staying here was a death sentence. I moved quickly, grabbing my coat, the money, the photograph, and a small case of clothes. My hands shook so badly I could barely fasten the clasps. The brass key from the man at the station felt like it was burning in my pocket. I didn't know yet what it opened, but instinct told me it mattered. The photograph was tucked into my coat lining close to my heart, as though its presence could shield me. Before leaving, I took one last look at the quiet rooms I'd thought were my safe haven. They seemed different now, like a stage after the actors have fled, leaving only the props behind. Then I stepped into the cold rain, keeping to the shadows, heading toward the station. If George had gone into the city, then that's where I'd find him, or his trail. The station was almost empty at that hour, its grand arches echoing with the muted clatter of a lone porter's trolley. I kept my head down, coat collar turned up against the rain, and bought a ticket to the same city George had named. My hands were damp inside my gloves, not from the weather but from the thought that each step was taking me closer to answers I might not want. The night train loomed at the platform, its dark carriages lined with rivets that caught the weak light. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp wool. Soldiers sat in pairs along the aisle, their uniforms casting a shadow over the few civilians scattered in the compartments. I found a seat near the back, keeping my bag close to my side. Two men in heavy coats were seated across the aisle, speaking in low voices. I wasn't trying to listen, but one word caught my ear. "Traitor." I glanced toward them, pretending to adjust my scarf, and saw one man tap his fingers against a folded newspaper, while the other's eyes scanned the carriage. My skin prickled. The train jolted forward, and I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A conductor passed through, checking tickets, his gaze lingering on me a heartbeat longer than necessary. When he returned minutes later, he didn't stop at my seat. Instead, as he walked by, his hand brushed my arm, slipping a folded scrap of paper into my lap. I waited until he'd gone before opening it. "Don't get off at the main station." The words blurred for a moment as my pulse quickened. Outside, the dark countryside slid past, each flash of lamplight catching my reflection in the window. I thought of George's last smile on the platform, how it had felt like a curtain closing. I tightened my grip on my bag, the envelope inside now more like a fuse than a gift, and forced myself to breathe evenly. Whatever lay ahead, I knew two things. The main station was a danger I couldn't afford, and someone on this train already knew who I was. When the train began to slow, the soldiers shifted in their seats, gathering their gear with the metallic clink of buckles and straps. The movement sent a ripple of tension through the carriage. I kept my eyes fixed on the rain-smeared glass, watching the blurred shapes of the city swell in the distance. The glow of the main station was creeping closer, grand, busy, and if the note was to be believed, deadly. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud enough that I feared it might draw attention. The air inside the compartment felt thicker, heavy with the damp breath of too many passengers. I tasted coal dust on my tongue. My mind raced. At the last moment, just before we reached the platform, I rose, careful not to let my bag swing too far from my side, and slipped into the narrow corridor. The polished wooden panels reflected my shadow in quick, jerking flashes as the train swayed. I moved toward the rear, each step sounding louder than it should have in the muted hum of the carriage. The conductor appeared as if he'd been waiting all along, his cap casting a sharp shadow across his eyes. Without a word, he motioned toward the door at the far end of the carriage, his gloved hand steady, despite the rocking of the train. The wind roared in as he unlocked it, the sudden blast of cold air cutting through my coat and whipping strands of hair across my face. Together we stepped onto the tiny, swaying platform between cars, the black rails blurred below, rushing past with a low, constant growl. "Next stop's unmarked," he said quickly, his voice almost lost in the noise. "You've got friends there, or at least fewer enemies." His eyes flicked to my bag, sharp and knowing. "Don't let anyone see that." Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he vanished back inside before I could ask a single question, the door clanging shut behind him. Minutes later, the train screeched to a halt beside a dim siding far from the lights of the main station. The sound echoed off unseen walls, and the carriage shuddered beneath my feet. I stepped down into the wet gravel, the stones shifting slightly under my boots. The air was thick with the smell of oil and smoke, and the faint hiss of cooling metal lingered as the train pulled away, leaving me in near darkness. The world felt strangely hollow without its noise. A faint yellow light glimmered ahead, flickering against the slick cobblestones of a narrow street. My steps echoed softly as I followed it, the cold settling into my bones. The buildings loomed on either side, their windows black, their gutters dripping with the night's rain. The light drew me to an abandoned warehouse, its brick walls dark with age, one single window still lit. Inside, voices murmured, low, deliberate, and close enough that I could feel the faint vibrations through the wood. I edged closer, my boots silent now on the wet ground, and peered through a narrow crack between the planks. My breath caught sharply. George was there, slumped in a chair, his shirt stained dark at the shoulder, the fabric clinging to him in damp, uneven patches. His hair was matted, his skin pale under the yellow light, and standing opposite him, very much alive, was the woman from the photograph. I pressed myself even closer, the damp wood cold against my cheek, straining to hear over the hammer of my own pulse. Her voice was sharp, accusatory, each word edged like a blade. "You sold us out, George." He shook his head, his voice hoarse, cracking in places. "I was protecting her, Doris, don't you understand?" The sound of my own name in that space felt like a stone dropped into deep water. Protecting me. From what? The woman leaned in, her eyes flashing with something between fury and desperation. "They know her name now, she's marked. If she's still alive, it's only because they're not ready to use her yet." Her words hung in the air, heavy as lead. A silence followed, the kind that presses against your eardrums. My fingers ached before I realized I was gripping the warehouse wall so tightly the splinters were digging into my skin. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I pushed the warehouse door open, the sound echoing through the dim space like a warning shot. Both heads snapped toward me, George's eyes widening in something between relief and dread, the woman's narrowing like the barrel of a gun, sharp and unyielding. The air inside was damp and close, thick with the mingled scents of old wood oil and the faint metallic tang of blood. Somewhere high above, a loose pane in the roof rattled under the wind. I closed the door behind me, the latch clicking shut, sealing us away from the cold night beyond. "Doris," George rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper, starting to rise but faltering halfway as the wound in his shoulder pulled at him. His hand went instinctively to the blood-dark fabric, and a thin groan escaped before he could swallow it down. "You shouldn't be here." His words carried a weight that made the space between us feel like a chasm. I ignored him, stepping closer until I could see the fine beads of sweat forming along his brow, sliding down his temple. "You're going to tell me," I said, my voice trembling yet sharp, "who she is, what you've done, and why strangers keep telling me my life's in danger." The question hung there, too large to be ignored. The woman spoke first, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "My name is Anna, and your husband has been lying to you for years." She didn't look away from me as she said it, but the corner of her mouth twisted in something like contempt when she glanced back at George. "We worked for the same side once, then he changed sides. Twice." The words fell like stones. My stomach churned, twisting as though the floor had tilted beneath me. "Are you saying he's a double agent?" She finished for me without hesitation, and now neither side trusts him. Her eyes flicked toward the shadows at the edges of the room, as though she could already hear the enemies gathering. George's gaze locked on mine, steady but shadowed with guilt. "Everything I did was to protect you. The money, the photograph, the key, they were your lifeline if I didn't come back." His voice cracked at the edges, the truth leaking through. "I made them believe I was turning against one side so I could buy us time, but the plan went wrong. They found your name." The sentence landed like a death toll, each word chipping away at whatever fragile safety I'd imagined still existed. I pulled the photograph from my coat, the paper slightly bent now from being carried too close to my heart. "And her? Why give me this?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. "Because if anything happened to me," he said finally, "she was the only one who could keep you alive." Anna looked away at that, her expression hardening, hands curling into fists she didn't quite unclench. The truth hit like a blow. The smile at the station hadn't been farewell to a wife. It had been the mask of a man sending a pawn into play. My life had been a piece on a board I didn't even know existed. My choices orchestrated long before I understood there was a game at all. The rain hammered against the warehouse roof, a steady, relentless drum that made it hard to tell if the sound outside was water or something worse. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the crunch of footsteps on wet gravel, measured, approaching. Anna's eyes darted to the window, her voice low and clipped. "They're here." Anna was already moving, her coat flaring as she pulled a revolver from beneath it, the metal catching the dim warehouse light. The sudden movement was like a spark in dry tinder. Everything went from stillness to chaos. George staggered to his feet, gripping my arm with a strength that surprised me despite the blood soaking his shirt. "We have to reach the border," he said, his voice ragged and uneven, the urgency pressing into me harder than his hand. "Once we're across, they can't touch you." Outside, the shadows shifted, stretching and breaking against the warped warehouse walls. 3, maybe 4 figures closing in. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder, a measured, relentless rhythm that set my pulse racing. We burst through the rear door into a narrow alley slick with rain, the wooden frame groaning behind us. Cold air knifed into my lungs, my breath escaping in ragged bursts that hung like smoke in the wet night. The cobblestones gleamed black under the flickering light from a distant street lamp. George clutched his shoulder with his free hand, blood dripping in dark, glistening beads that the rain tried and failed to wash away. Still, he didn't slow. Anna moved like she'd memorized the streets, her dark silhouette cutting ahead of us, leading toward the faint golden glow of the freight yard. There, a row of trains hissed in the darkness like great sleeping beasts, their metal skins beaded with rain. Shouts tore through the night behind us, sharp and guttural, followed by the echo of running feet. A gunshot cracked, shattering the tension into something raw and electric, a splinter of wood exploding above my head and raining down sharp fragments. I ducked instinctively, my ears ringing, and we darted between 2 idle carriages, the narrow gap thick with the smells of iron, oil, and damp timber. Steam hissed somewhere close, curling white into the darkness. George's gaze flicked to the left, locking on a slow-moving freight train beginning to pull away from the yard. "This is it!" he shouted over the roar of the rain, his voice barely audible above the rising chaos. The 3 of us sprinted, our boots skidding and slipping on the wet stones. The train's wheels screamed against the tracks as it gathered speed, its shadowed carriages rattling like bones. Another shot rang out. Closer this time, Anna stumbled, her foot catching on the uneven ground, but she caught herself without breaking stride. My breath burned as we closed the gap. George's hand found mine, his grip fierce, anchoring me in the blur of movement. His eyes locked with mine for a heartbeat, and in that moment I saw the same smile from the station, sad, resolute, knowing. "Live, Doris," he said, the words heavy with something final, and before I could protest, before I could even understand, he pushed me hard toward the train. My shoulder slammed against cold metal as I caught the edge of the moving carriage. I scrambled up, my hands slipping on the slick surface, my knees finding purchase just as the train dragged me away. I twisted back, shouting his name into the rain, my voice torn apart by the wind. Through the shifting sheets of water, I saw George turn to face the shadows charging toward him, Anna stepping up beside him with her revolver raised. Then the darkness swallowed them both, and the rain was all I could see. It was only then, as the train pulled me further from the freight yard, that I felt the weight in my bag, heavier than before, pressing against my side like a secret. I dropped to my knees on the wooden floor, the movement swaying with the train's rhythm, and unbuckled the clasp. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that smelled faintly of tobacco, was the photograph, the stack of worn banknotes, and a folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, George's hand. Just one word was written there: live. Weeks later, in a border town where no one knew my name and the language still felt foreign on my tongue, I learned the truth. George Ellison had never existed. His real name, buried in half-forgotten intelligence files and whispered rumors, was George Marlowe, and the woman in the photograph was not a lover at all but his sister. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales and twists you won't see coming.